Good morning, students. Let's continue with our topic Rights in the Indian Constitution. Today we will discuss Directive Principles of State Policy. Chapter 4 of Constitution, Directive Principles. Now, what is Directive Principle? The makers of our constitution knew that the independent India was going to face many challenges. Among these was the challenge to bring about equality and well-being of all citizens, because before independence the situation of our society was very poor. There were lots of untouchability were in practice. Constitution makers knew very well that India is going to face many challenges. They also thought that certain policy direction was required for handling these problems. At the same time, the Constitution did not want future governments to be bound by certain policy decisions. Means, the Constitution makers knew very well that in future Indian government will have to face some challenges, and so they provided some principles, but at the same time they did not want future government to be bound by certain policy decisions. So what was the solution? Therefore, some guidelines were incorporated in Constitution, but they were not made legally enforceable. Means, these were only guidelines and they were not made enforceable. If government is not incorporating those guidelines, then no one can go to court for their enforcement. This means that if a government did not implement a particular guideline, we cannot go to the court asking the court to instruct the government to implement that policy. Thus, these guidelines are non-justiciable. Means, parts of the Constitution that cannot be enforced by the judiciary. So, what is the meaning of non-justiciable? Non-justiciable means part of Constitution that cannot be enforced by judiciary, and some policies, some guidelines are made by our constitution maker but non-justiciable. Those who framed our constitution thought that the moral force behind these guidelines would ensure that the government would take them seriously. Besides, they expected that the people would also hold the government responsible for implementing these directives. So, a separate list of policy guidelines is included in the Constitution. The list of these guidelines is called Directive Principles of State Policy. Means directive principles are some directions made by Constitution to the government. These are some guidelines made by our constitution makers for our government. Now, what do the directive principle contains? What are these guidelines? Directive principle list mainly contain three things: the goals and objectives that we as a society should adopt. Second, certain rights that individuals should enjoy apart from the fundamental rights, and certain policies that the government should adopt. So in directive principles, what directions were there, what guidelines were given? Some guidelines were given just to adopt the goals and objectives of a society. Some rights other than fundamental rights that individual should enjoy, and certain policies that the government should adopt. Government from time to time tried to give effect to some directive principles of state policy. They passed several zamindari abolition bills, nationalized banks, enacted numerous factory laws, fixed minimum wages, cottage and small industries were promoted, and provisions for reservation for the uplift of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes were made. Such efforts to give effect to the directive principles include the right to education, formation of Panchayati Raj institution all over the country, partial right to work under employment guarantee program, and the midday meal scheme, etc. So these are the provision which were made, for which directions were given, and government took steps to implement these guidelines. In 1976, by the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, a list of fundamental duties of citizen is inserted, in which 10 duties were enumerated, and Constitution does not say anything about enforcing these duties. But as citizen, we must abide by the Constitution, defend our country, promote harmony among all citizens, and protect the environment. So, fundamental duties are also incorporated. Now, the next topic is relationship between fundamental rights and directive principles. Here, fundamental rights and directive principles are complementary to each other. Fundamental rights restrain the government from doing certain things while directive principle urge the government to do certain things. Fundamental rights mainly protect the rights of individuals, while directive principles ensure the well-being of entire society. However, at times when government intends to implement directive principles of state policy, it can come in conflict with the fundamental rights of the citizen. Though they both are complementary to each other, but at the time of implementation, they can come in conflict with each other. This problem arose when the government sought to pass law to abolish zamindari system. These measures were opposed on the ground that they violated right to property. Actually, keeping in mind the societal needs that are greater than the individual's interest, the government amended the constitution to give effect to the directive principles of state policy. This led to a long legal battle. The executive and the judiciary took different positions. The government claimed that right can be abridged for giving effect to directive principles. This argument assumed that rights were a hindrance to welfare of the people. On the other hand, the court held that fundamental rights were so important and sacred that they cannot be limited even for purpose of implementing directive principles. This generated another complicated debate. This related to the amendment of constitution. The government was saying that parliament can amend any part of the constitution. The court was saying that parliament cannot make an amendment that violated fundamental rights. This controversy was settled by an important decision of Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharti case. In this case, the court said that there are certain basic features of the constitution and these basic features cannot be changed by parliament. Now here we will discuss about the controversy behind the case. Actually, it was about the fundamental right to property and also about the relationship between rights and directive principles. There was one important reason. In the constitution originally, there was a fundamental right to acquire, possess and maintain property. Means acquire and having property was under fundamental rights. But the constitution made it clear that property could be taken away by the government for public welfare. Since 1950, government made many laws that limited this right to property. This right was at the center of the long debate over the relationship between rights and directive principles. Finally, in 1973, the Supreme Court gave a decision that the right to property was not part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore Parliament had power to abridge this right by an amendment. And in 1978, the 44th Amendment to the Constitution removed the right to property from the list of fundamental rights and converted it into a simple legal right under Article 300A. We have seen fundamental rights and directive principles are complementary to each other, but sometimes they come face to face at the time of implementation of directive principles. In these cases, a basic feature, an important concept of basic features of Constitution was evolved. So, this is all about this chapter. In our next class, we will do another chapter. Thank you.